It's all about the bass, no treble. Hello, and welcome to Apple Jams, your Beatles and solo Beatles hangout. I'm so glad to see you here, so glad you could come. I have one little baby request, and that is if you would please me by smashing a like on this video and subscribing if you haven't already. That would really help me if you can. So thanks for joining me here in a slightly different setup here in Apple Jam Towers. I've relocated to my kitchen so that I don't wake anybody up. Okay, so let's talk about The Lost Bass. I have now watched the documentary and I have some thoughts. I'm assuming you guys will have as well, but I am going to be really honest with you. This review is good. Well, if you can even call it a review, this chat is going to be spoilery. Because I'm going to chat about the film and, key plot points in the film, what I thought about the film. So this is your warning. If you've not yet seen the film, go ahead, and it should be available now on BBC iPlayer if you're in the UK, or if you're in the States, hopefully you've seen it in the cinema, but otherwise be aware this is going to be a spoilery video. So the film starts with Paul McCartney sitting down to be interviewed for the start of the film, and he's very much in Paul McCartney PR mode. Okay, yeah, woo, the lost bass, let's talk about it, yeah, the lost bass. That kind of thing. I love that he's wearing yellow submarine socks, by the way, so keep an eye out for that. What's clear is that the access in this film is really good. They've got loads of Beatles songs that run throughout the film, they've got some solo McCartney songs, they've got archive footage, so yeah, it's, clearly there's been the blessing of Apple and Paul McCartney himself in terms of accessing all that material. In the opening moments, there's footage from the Cavern Club, there's footage from Shea Stadium, Get Back, obviously all stuff that we've seen before, but yeah, again, nice that we get to see it to kind of like add context to the documentary. And then we have Mike McCarthy showing us around Forthlin Road, which is obviously the house where Paul McCartney grew up in Liverpool, which is now a National Trust property. Meanwhile, throngs of Beatles fans watch from outside as this is being filmed inside Forthlin Road. That's interspersed with some nice black and white shots of Forthlin Road, like shots of the kitchen, of like teacups on the shelf and things like that, and the sink and kind of like worktop area. I presume that these photos are taken by Mike McCartney. Obviously, he was a keen photographer. As we know, he took the famous photo of Paul in the backyard from Chaos and Creation in the Backyard. Now, Forthlin Road was purchased and made to look like it did in the 1950s and early 60s, when Paul and Mike would have lived there. So I'm interested in whether these photographs are actually from that time and indeed taken by Mike McCartney, or whether they were, taken of the new, the recreation of Forthlin Road as it exists in more modern times. Obviously, it's a lot more interesting to see how it looked back then. Don't know what the deal is there. Maybe somebody, if you do know, let me know in the comments. Are these photos genuine and of that time? It's nice to hear Mike reminisce and refer to his brother as our kid. It's always very charming. Then the story moves on to Hamburg, and there's a live rendition of Kansas City Yeah Yeah, which I don't recognize, so I wonder if that is taken from the Star Club tapes. Obviously, we know that Peter Jackson has those and is presumably working on cleaning those up, so yeah, I reckon at some point we're going to get a release of the Star Club tapes, and I'm here for it. I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to hear that. I'm sure plenty of you have heard the release that we've had so far. I've never heard it myself. Maybe I'll just wait for the release of the inevitable Peter Jackson cleaned up Star Club tapes. But yeah, maybe this is a sneak peek of that. And then we see Klaus Vormann next, and he's narrating these shots of Hamburg, speaking about his friendships with the Beatles. Klaus speaks quite affectionately about Paul in particular, and shows us a little answer machine message of Paul just ringing him for a chat, which is nice to hear. Paul speaks about picking up bass duties from Stuart Sutcliffe, who obviously left the band because he fell in love with Astrid Kircher and wanted to spend more time on his art. And there's a story of Klaus saying to John that he could be the bass player, and John saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, Paul's picked that up and he's just bought himself a new bass." Klaus seems genuinely regretful that that's the way that things turned out. Can you imagine? He could have been the fifth Beatle. Oh, what could have been? Now, Klaus sits down and does some charcoal sketches that kind of like pop up throughout the documentary and illustrate certain narrative beats throughout the film. It's actually a really nice touch, and they're great pictures. And then there's footage of the Beatles playing in the Cavern Club, the Some Other Guy footage, which we'll have seen many times on other documentaries, but that's shown to illustrate that that's him playing that original bass that he picked up in Hamburg. Again, there's plenty of Beatles music throughout the documentary, and there's a really nice moment where they're showing Paul play All My Love. Well, the Beatles as a whole play All My Lovin'. They isolate the bass part and Paul's melodic bass playing, the doo 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 doo, and it's a really effective little moment. I really enjoyed that bit. And then we meet a chap who works for, or did work for, Hofner, called Nick Voss, I think, or Was. It's Wass. I'm not entirely sure how to say it. Who the documentary referred to as Mr. Hofner, and he's apparently the guy who McCartney approached and said, "Hey, where's my bass?" So this chap put together the hashtag Trace the Bass website, which is a nifty title that his wife actually came up with. There's a lot of talk about how the 1961 bass kind of played back up to another bass that he got in 1963. So he effectively, during the Beatles' time, he had two of these Hofner basses. The one that was the original one that he played in Hamburg and at the Cavern and on those early Beatles tracks, and then he replaced it with one that he got in 1963, and then thereafter the 1961 bass was kind of like a backup one. And that kind of gets me to the crux of the issue that I had initially with this documentary, in that I just didn't buy that McCartney had that much of a sentimental attachment to it. I've got a feeling that it meant more to the fans more than it did to Paul, to be honest. And sure, he's playing it up now, but and I'm sure, he was genuinely very fond of it and was disappointed when it went missing. But I don't know. I wonder if he's actually given it that much thought over the last 50 years, or whether he's just playing up for it now because these, dedicated fans went out and actually found it for him. Obviously, the Hofner bass is iconic and it's intrinsically linked with Paul McCartney. And that one is the original one, but it's by no means the most played. It's all a little fanciful, isn't it? So there's quite a long time spent on the history of the Beatles told through the lens of this bass that was essentially a backup bass, and that takes us right through from the start up until the breakup of the Beatles. And I think we're about halfway through the film by this point. So the first half of the film is kind of spent on the history of that particular instrument. And then we hear from Scott Jones, a journalist who is referred to as a bass detective. He speaks about watching Paul at Glastonbury in 2022, and with his wife Naomi, he gets interested in searching for the original bass. He comes across the Trace the Bass website, and they start chatting with Nick and sharing emails that they end up trawling through together that have come through the website. And then we meet a superfan called Andy Dickinson, who's come across this quest to find the lost bass and chats about it with his ambulance driving colleague, who interestingly seems to know what happened to this bass and that it was stolen from a house in London. Quite how he knows this, at this point at least, remains unclear. So they email in and they pretend that they say that it was stolen from a house in London, and they say that information came from somebody who they had in the back of their ambulance. But Nick sees right through this and doesn't really give it the time of day, to be honest. Meanwhile, Ian Horn, who works as an engineer for Wings, gets in touch and says, well, I worked for Paul McCartney, so their ears prick up at this news, of course. There's a section of the documentary now where he goes into quite forensic, beat-by-beat detail about what led up to the bass being stolen from the back of his truck, which was parked near his brother-in-law's apartment. Now, we know this story, and by we, I mean, proper Beatle nerds, but more casual fans won't. So I can forgive the documentary for this kind of overblown storytelling used here to explain that basically the bass was stolen from the back of a van. That would have reduced the runtime, wouldn't it? The bass was stolen from the back of a van. But Ian's story and what he did next is quite a compelling human interest hook. And he did go into his feelings of panic and resolve to try and find the bass and fix this problem himself. And they had a suspect that lived nearby in mind. That suspect was a chap called Dick Mick, which is an interesting name, who was a roadie and synth player for the band Hawkwind. The suspicion seemed to be just that he seemed a bit shifty. In Ian's words, he went round, tooled up and scared the life out of him, but he didn't find the bass. So that was something of a non-event. So then they have to go and tell McCartney, and they're bracing themselves at the thought of being, torn off a strip. We know that McCartney can have a bit of a temper. But Paul just said, yeah, it's all right, I've got another one. You see, he's not bothered. There is a good point made that maybe the bass wasn't as important to him then as it became later on. And I think that's a really interesting point, because at that point in his career, he was kind of trying to move on from the Beatles, and anything that was so, iconically linked with that band, he probably did kind of want to put a little bit of emotional distance with. Going back to Dick Mick, there was a suggestion in the documentary that the wider band Hawkwind had a motive as they were an anti-Beatles band. But again, that doesn't really go anywhere in terms of the narrative of the documentary. So Ian gets in touch with these investigators, and that story lines up with the story from the ambulance drivers. So at that point, they think, oh, okay, well, maybe this is worth exploring some more. So the other ambulance driver is a chap called Steve Glenister, and he's the guy where this information came from initially. And he speaks about growing up in the vicinity of where the bass was stolen from and hearing that it had ended up in a pub where lots of shady dealings go down. And then they thought, well, we'll never get rid of it, so ended up being chucked in a canal. I mean, the point is made at some point that you've basically stolen the Mona Lisa. What are you going to do with it? And who they are at this point is very unclear. Anyway, the documentary moves on from here, and then we're looking at some footage of Elvis Costello and McCartney in the studio working together on what would become Flowers in the Dirt. And this is a real highlight of the documentary for me. The Elvis Costello and Paul McCartney collaboration is one of my favourite periods of McCartney. So Elvis Costello goes into the encouragement that he gave to McCartney to go back to his original Hofner bass, because he'd not really touched it since the Beatles days because he'd moved on to a Rickenbacker bass. Elvis Costello was telling this story about like watching him whilst they were rehearsing and him doing all these wonderful little noodles on the bass, but him saying that you couldn't really hear them because the Rickenbacker was like too loud or something. So those intricate little melodic moves didn't come through or weren't quite as prominent as you might otherwise have expected. It doesn't really make much sense to me, but I'm not a musician, so I'll leave that up to Paul and Elvis to explain. But yeah, Elvis suggests that going back to the original Hofner would be better and, you know, like more, I don't know, fuller sound or something. It'd bring out those kind of like little noodles that he does. So he does. He picks up, you know, the 1963 Hofner bass and uses that for the recording of the album. And it's suggested that returning to the Hofner at this time gets him all sentimental for his original 1961 bass. And I'm still a bit unconvinced by this because it's other people saying this about McCartney. It's not him saying it himself. Again, I'm sure he would have liked it back, but I'm not overly convinced that he's attached that much sentimentality to that particular instrument. In fact, the next thing is Paul McCartney in Talking Heads saying, well, I was just annoyed that somebody had nicked it. Not exactly a longing for something that was once lost, more, I don't know, a retribution and justice instinct. So the investigation moves on, and the investigators find out that Stephen Glenister's parents were registered at 100 Cambridge Gardens, which is the property that the van where the bass was stolen from is parked outside. So it turns out that there must be a reason why Stephen knows so much about it with this, you know, quite clear connection. And Nick goes to him and says, you're not telling us the whole story here. Steve Glenister's dad was the thief that stole the bass from the back of that van. And he tells his son when he's in his 20s. The story being that it did end up with the local pub landlord. He just thought, right, well, give us a couple of drinks and you can have this bass. So the landlord is long since dead. So the investigators try and get in touch with the children of the landlord. And it turns out that the bass was handed down to one of the landlord's sons, who sadly died in a car accident. But they speak to an Elaine Guest who suggests that none of them actually knew that it was Paul McCartney's bass. Which is feasible, of course. I mean, the landlord probably didn't ask too many questions. Sounds like there were plenty of shady dealings going on in that pub anyway. So apparently an estranged brother took the bass to a house in Hastings. Kathy Guest, who presumably is this brother's wife, is seen on ITV explaining that she found the bass and took it to his house. What? To Paul McCartney's house? Is he that easy to find? So at that point, the mystery's all wrapped up and there's a little bit of tying up loose ends. So they track down the bass. It gets returned to Paul's technical manager, who then sees to it getting restored. Obviously, it's been in a loft for so many years, so it needs a fair bit of work. The best bit of the documentary for me is speaking to Stephen Glenister and him talking about how he doesn't want his father to be vilified, that, you know, they were hard up and his dad was a good man who just did what he could to make ends meet, and that wasn't always above board. For me, Stephen is the most interesting person in this documentary. Initially seeming enthusiastic, but somewhat elusive and mysterious. And then it turns out that he's got this direct connection with the bass, and he's obviously had to balance a willingness to help and have the bass rediscovered with wanting to protect his dad's reputation, and you can see that conflict within him. Paul has the good grace to say that he doesn't blame him, which is, to be fair, quite gracious of him. When Paul is eventually reunited with his bass, he does seem genuinely made up to see it again, and it's a nice little moment. His technical manager who gives it to him says, you know, you've not played that bass in 50 years, and I don't know, he just takes a step back and takes a moment to take that in. The documentary ends with these investigators going to see Paul live on his tour, where he does actually bring the bass out in London. It's quite a moment, I'm not going to lie, and it's lovely to see the investigators experience that, given that they were so influential in making it happen. Now, just before Paul is reunited with the bass, we see him working in the studio in Hog Hill, and there's a snippet of a track that you can hear before the scene moves on, and I've certainly never heard that track before. It sounds quite funky, there's some horns and it's got some backing vocals, and it sounds like Paul's singing Shake Your Body. Very interesting. I mean, it's very different from what we've been led to expect from the boys of Dungeon Lane, but I don't know, is this a new McCartney track? Later on, there's also a little bit of incidental music that sounds quite Abbey Road-esque, and I wondered to myself again, like, is that an instrumental part of what's going to be on The Boys of Dungeon Lane? You heard it here first! So what did I think of this documentary? Well, I think it's well worth seeing for Beatles fans. The first half of it kind of deals with the history of the bass, and then the second half is more based on the investigation. If I'm being honest, I did find the second half a little difficult to follow. I'm still not entirely sure how the bass was located, whether it was the investigators actually tracking down the house and approaching Kathy Guest, or was it that by nature of the publicity that it was getting at the time, that Kathy found it in her attic while she was looking at other things and, put two and two together and thought, oh my goodness, this might actually be Paul McCartney's bass. I don't know, and I've just watched a documentary on it, so yeah, that's a little disappointing. The most interesting characters are the ambulance drivers, one being a super fan and one being the son of the guy who nicked it. So an incredible coincidence that fate just brought these two people together at the right time. I like the accidental echo that happened whereby Andy, the superfan, shows off his bass playing skills towards the start of the documentary by fumbling his way through Day Tripper, and then when McCartney's reunited with his bass towards the end, he does the exact same thing, and to be fair, shows him how it's done. He nails it, obviously. Now, it is an extraordinary story, don't get me wrong, but as I initially suspected, I don't think there were enough twists and turns to really justify the hour-and-a-half runtime. And there's certainly no real drama or high stakes. The only thing really approaching that is when Ian Horn gets tooled up to go and accuse Dick Mick, but that didn't really go anywhere. And again, having to plump up the courage to go and tell McCartney that he's basically responsible for his bass being nicked. But again, McCartney wasn't bothered, so that didn't really go anywhere. So it's a nice little story with high production values, great access to Beatles songs and archive, and a nice tidy little story. But if I'm being honest, outside of the bass that's been lost for 50 years is found narrative, it's not that interesting a story, I've got to be honest. Obviously, it's nice to see Paul reunited with it. That's worth the asking price alone. But I don't think I'm going to come back to this documentary again. Not like I will with, Get Back or Man on the Run. It's a one and done for me, and that's fine. But let me know what you think. Have you seen it now? Did you catch it on iPlayer, or did you see it at the cinema? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. It really helps. With that said, all that's left to say is ta-ra for now, and thanks for watching.